All right, here at Vogel State Park for the Cruel Jewel 100, and starts in about hour and 15 minutes, and there are just mountains everywhere around here, as you can kind of tell. Check out right there. I don't know if that's where the course is going, but probably. So definitely pretty nervous, pretty anxious, but my training has been super good for this race. I have no reason not to be confident, so just ready to get running and get in the mountains and just I don't know, just get in the zone. What's up everybody? Father Zach here with another race review. So first of all, you might be thinking, what on earth is this dude wearing? Well, I've said in some previous videos that I am a Franciscan friar and a Catholic priest. So what I'm actually wearing right now is my Franciscan habit. This would have been like what St. Francis of Assisi wore in medieval times. So I just got finished saying Mass a few minutes ago, and I walked right up into this studio here to record this video. So decided to just roll with my habit today, just to kind of show you guys what I wear on a normal day. Anyway, the race I want to talk to you guys about today is the Cruel Jewel 100, a race that took place in Blairsville, Georgia on May 13th through the 15th of 2022. So my goal here today is to not only tell you guys about my experience running Cruel Jewel 100, but also to just give you kind of an overview of the race. Maybe you're watching this video because you're thinking about running Cruel Jewel 100 in a year from now, or 2 years from now, or sometime in the future. And I want to make sure that if you watch this, hopefully you go away knowing a little bit more about what the course is like and what to expect. Now, an ongoing theme I'm realizing about 100-mile races is that oftentimes they're advertised, they're called the 100-mile race, but then when you dig into the stats, you find out that the race is actually significantly longer. So in the case of Cruel Jewel 100, the race distance is actually 106 miles, at least that's what it says on the website for the race, but I found that it was probably a little bit longer. My GPS watch, and I wear a Garmin Forerunner, my GPS actually came up with 114 miles. I know some people were hitting more like 108, 110, so take that for what it's worth. Race is probably around 106 miles, maybe even a little bit longer. And for this thing, we're talking 33,000 feet of elevation over the span of about 106 miles. So that's like Everest. That's like summiting Everest and then some. This race was no joke. So anyway, I signed up for Cruel Jewel on a whim, really. I was coming off a high from finishing Grindstone, and I think a lot of us have been there before. You finish a race, and you just, on that you just feel like nothing can stop you, right? And before you ever even, your muscles are still sore, and you're still like hurting and wondering, what on earth did I just accomplish? And the next thing you know, you're on Ultra Sign Up, and you're signing up for another race. So that was my experience with Cruel Jewel. But honestly, I found myself struggling to get motivated for this race. A lot of people may not think about this beforehand, but the hardest part of running an ultramarathon is not actually running the race. At that point, as my old track coach used to say, the hay is in the barn, right? You've done the work. The most difficult part of preparing and executing on a 100-mile race is the training. The training is what takes so much out of you, both physically, but what I found this time around, most of all, mentally. Guys, I just didn't have it this time around. I was finding it so hard to get out of the house, to get out on the trails and run. I was busy with a lot of things going on at the church here where I'm stationed in Texas, and we were hitting that period where the weather's starting to warm up here. I mean, in Texas, come March, you're already getting into these hot, humid temperatures, and it gets really difficult to get motivated to get out the door. I knew that if I was actually going to train for and complete the Cruel Jewel 100, I would need a why. I would need a reason for doing this. And to be honest with you, I just didn't have one. But that all changed for me in the middle of March. I was out for a training run, trying to get about 18-20 miles in on a trail near where I live, and about halfway through my run I realized my phone was ringing consistently, and it was from a lot of people I hadn't talked to in a while, and I was really curious what's going on here. So I stopped off the side of the trail and I looked at some of the messages that I had been missing, and I came to find that my college roommate, a guy by the name of Brian, a good friend of mine, a teammate with me on my track and cross country team at St. Francis University in Pennsylvania, I came to find that he had died unexpectedly just the previous day. And the thing about Brian is that he was the toughest dude I've ever met in my life. He was literally unlike anyone I've ever come across. So after I learned about Brian's passing and I got a chance to go out to his funeral in Philadelphia and serve as a priest at his funeral mass, when I came back to Texas, I felt like I had a renewed sense of mission for running this race. I was going to do this thing to honor my friend Brian. So the day before the race, I flew from Dallas into Atlanta. Unfortunately, I had to wait about 2 hours in line for my rental car at Thrifty, which there was a lot of college graduations going on in the Atlanta area, so that really slowed things down, but it's okay because my flight came in early enough that it wasn't going to be a huge problem. I made it to the Verbo at around 8 p.m. that night. I stopped to get something to eat, stopped to grab some snacks and stuff that I would want for the race over the weekend. And honestly, one of the most memorable parts of the weekend was making that drive from Atlanta up to Blairsville. Blairsville's pretty close to like the Tennessee and North Carolina borders, very mountainous. And when you're coming up into that area, you go from pretty flat near Atlanta and all of a sudden you just start driving up into the mountains. And the sun was going down, it was an awesome night, there were some dark clouds rolling in. And I just remember looking up at these mountain peaks and just being so pumped. I was so excited. I could barely contain myself that I was gonna get to be running in such beautiful mountains like that. So I don't want to go into great detail about the pre-race stuff, but I'll just say this. We stayed in a Verbo that ended up being like halfway between the start point of the race and the turnaround point of the race. And I say that because I feel like a lot of times the general wisdom is that you get a place to stay that's pretty close to the race start. And it just so happened when I was looking at available options, I found this place that was literally halfway on the race course, which doesn't sound ideal until you realize that every single crew aid station was pretty much within like a half-hour distance of this one location, which worked so perfectly for my crew. So my crew for the Cruel Jewel 100 was my mom and dad, who have crewed me at like every big race I've done, and they've gotten to be masters at this. They're so good at knowing exactly what I need when I need it. I had my brother with me this time to help pace. And I also had one of the parishioners here at the church I serve at in Texas was really intrigued by this whole ultra thing, and he decided he was actually going to make the drive from Dallas, Texas to Atlanta, Georgia, just to watch this race for the weekend. And this guy, Joe, when we're talking about the plan that he was going to do this, I was like, dude, like, I hope you know what you're getting into. Like, you're going to see me run out of the woods, eat some food, and then run back into the woods. And like, as long as you're cool with that, I'm more than happy to have you come and support the effort. Woke up on race day around 7 in the morning. Cruel Jewel is a noon start time, which is awesome. So had a chance to do some last minute gear checks. Went and with my family, and we got some breakfast at the Blairsville Skillet, which is like a little diner. Got like an omelet or something with a lot of like eggs and meat. It was a perfect pre-race meal. And then all together we drove a little bit south of there to Vogel State Park, which is where the Cruel Jewel 100 was set to begin. And I love packet pickup for races. It's such a silly thing to say, but there's always so much energy, you know? People traveling from all over the country, and there's just this anxiety about what's about to happen. People are obviously confident about what they're about to undertake, but at the same time, there's a lot of nervous energy. We're about to go into the woods, into the mountains for potentially 2 straight days. One of the great things about Cruel Jewel 100 is that the race organizers actually give you a little laminated card to bring with you. It shows what all the aid stations are and the mileage of each aid station and the distance between aid stations. So even when you're tired, you always know what to expect.
Do you see him at all? Hey. There he is.
There you go, shine side.
All right, Zach.
The next couple days in the race. Good luck, everybody. Thank you. Go West, go. Good luck.
So the Cruel Jewel 100 started all at once. And what an awesome thing this was. The past few 100-milers I've done have been wave starts because of the COVID pandemic. So for us to all start at one time, to me it felt like symbolic. Like this is the end of this pandemic that's been so burdensome for so long. So the beginning of the course is just on a road through Vogel State Park, probably like a mile or so. A lot of energy, great for spectators, which it's a lot of fun to actually run the beginning of a race on a road like that where you can have that energy. That's not always the case. But then you basically head right into the woods, and that is that. You don't see anybody again until that first crew accessible aid station, which isn't until mile like 21. So to kind of help out anyone who's thinking about running Cruel Jewel 100, I want to break the course down into specific parts. Now this isn't any sort of official breakdown, this is just how I came to internalize the different parts of the race as the race was going. Part 1 is the Dragon's Spine. This is the most infamous part of the Cruel Jewel 100. They've got signs that say things like the dragon is waiting, it's meant to intimidate you, meant to scare you, and it is pretty scary, let's be honest. The Dragon's Spine follows what's called the Duncan Ridge Trail, which extends through basically the beginning of the race all the way until close to mile 20 or so. And this is a very up and down section. So like hence the name Dragon's Spine, right? You're going up, you're going down, very steep and pretty technical most of the time. The Dragon's Spine ends at the Skeena Gap aid station, which is the first crew accessible aid station. Then the next segment of the race is what I just referred to in my mind as the Twin Peaks. Now I don't have like an elevation chart or a topographical map in front of me, so I can't justify this. But to me, this part of the race essentially just felt like aid station followed by summiting and descending a mountain, then another aid station, then summiting and descending a mountain again into another aid station. So that section ended in the Old Dial Road aid station, another crew accessible aid station. And then you had the third segment of the race, which was the road section. This is about a 5-mile section of paved road, and it kind of ranged from a little bit more like neighborhood residential road along a river to a little bit more of a main road, and then back to like a dirt road, kind of country road. So you kind of had a real mix of different types of road surface to run on over the span of those 5 miles. Then at the Stanley Gap aid station, you kind of continue into what I would consider the fourth, let's say, segment of this race, which was from Stanley Gap to the turnaround point. And this was the part of the race that incorporates the Flat Creek Loop, which is a 6-mile loop that you actually run twice over the course of the race. And then of course this is an out and back race, so everything on the way out would be the same coming back with one exception. You actually hit a 5th segment of the race here, which would be the Weaver Creek out and back, the spur trail. So now that I've laid out those segments, I want to just kind of go through the race and kind of tell you the story of what that progress was like from the start of the race all the way through mile 106. Once you get into the woods, it's a little bit of a tease because the first 3 miles or so of the race is very runnable. There's a very gradual uphill and then a pretty gradual downhill. So everyone's hitting that spot at a nice pace. I know I was with a group where we were kind of running right around 11 or 12 minute mile pace, which in a 100-mile race, especially something as technical and difficult as Cruel Jewel 100, that's a pretty nice pace to start a race at. But once you hit this first kind of unofficial aid station, which is just a water drop, you take a turn vertically. And the next, let's say 4 or 5 miles of this race is just a brutal climb. And this is the biggest climb on the race. This is about 2,000 plus feet over the span of just a few miles up to Kusabald, which is one of the tallest peaks in the whole Chattahoochee forest, and also one of the tallest peaks in the state of Georgia. At the top of that peak is the Fire Pit Aid Station, which is the first official aid station. And from that point on, you're hitting kind of this drastic up and down section that takes you up to Fish Gap, which is your second official aid station after you cover about 7 miles. And then from Fish Gap to Skeena Gap, which is your first crew aided station at mile 21 or 22, that part is all pretty runnable. It's an opportunity to settle into a nice steady running pace to kind of make up for some of the very difficult spots before that, where maybe you have to do a lot of power hiking and a lot of and be really careful with your footing. Personally, I found the first time through the Dragon Spine section of the course to be pretty easy, which makes sense, right? I mean, if you're running the Cruel Jewel 100, it's probably a given that you've been doing some preparation for some pretty intense climbing. And as difficult as this section of the course is, it's really only the span of 20-something miles, and it's taking only about 6 hours. At least that's what it took me. I would assume it took the leaders of the race significantly less time. It also helped that I ran the Grindstone 100 in Virginia just a few months prior to the Cruel Jewel. And for me, that was my first real encounter with some of these, what I would consider to be substantial climbs, thousands of feet at a time. And the Grindstone really shook me. When I first saw some of those climbs in that race, I was shocked. So by the time I got to Cruel Jewel, some of that surprise factor was gone. So it allowed me to kind of approach those first 22 miles with a little bit of a sense that I had been there before and had conquered something very similar to that in the past. First crew aid station at Skeena Gap at mile 22 was super high energy. This was a theme with basically the whole race. It's like these guys internally at all the people at these aid stations, it's like they were just battling amongst each other to see who had the most energetic aid station, which is an awesome thing if you run a race like this, to have great volunteers, and these volunteers were outstanding. The next part of the race was, as I said before, I kind of referred to as these twin peaks. It was, to me, just a part of the race that I'm having a lot of trouble remembering, other than I just felt like after each of these aid stations, you would just go up to the top of a mountain, and then you'd go back down the mountain, and then you'd hit another aid station, and then you would rinse and repeat and do that again. I basically only have like 2 memories over that part of the course. The first is that the Will Scott Gap aid station was awesome. Almost everybody there, all the volunteers, well, at least a lot of them, were all wearing the Cruel Jewel 100 belt buckles. And a lot of people, if they know one thing about the Cruel Jewel 100, it's that this race might have the best buckle in all of ultra running. Take a look at this thing. This is one heck of a buckle. You've got the course elevation profile there with the Cruel Jewel 100 mile finisher. This buckle is just awesome. It actually, on my way back from the race, this thing set off the metal detectors at the airport, and they had to do a whole search of my bag just to find what on earth is this giant metal object you're carrying, and it turned out to be my buckle. So that's the first time that's ever happened, but it kind of speaks how awesome this thing is. And I got a kick out of the fact that throughout the race, a lot of times when I would talk to people about like, hey, why'd you sign up for this race? Why are you out in the woods running 106 miles, right? It's a good question to ask somebody. And so many people have the same answer. They're like, man, I want that buckle. I want that buckle. That's the best buckle I've ever seen. And I love how comically superficial of an answer that is, but hey, I was right there with these people. I'm like, man, I want that buckle too. So I'd be lying if I said that didn't kind of keep me going when times got rough. After this kind of Twin Peaks section, you hit the Old Dial Road aid station, which is another crew aided station, which was great. I got to receive some support, some aid from my mom and my dad and my friend Joe. My brother at that time was sleeping because he was resting up for when he would come in to pace me for basically the entire inbound part of the race. And this is the part of the course where you're actually on a road for about 5 miles, which sounds kind of miserable, but I found that at this part of the race, when you do this outbound, it was pretty nice. The first few miles you're running along this kind of creek or river, and there's a lot of houses off to the side of you, and people were actually like on their porches, just kind of like drinking beer, hanging out, and cheering all the runners on, which was honestly awesome. Especially at that point you're over 30 miles, and gosh, any bit of support you can get is great. Then you run through kind of a small town on a little bit more of a substantial kind of 2-lane highway looking thing. And then before you know it, you're veering back up into the mountains on more of a gravel type road that kind of gets gradually uphill and then steeper as you go. All in all, I found that part to be very runnable, barring the steeper part at the end where you kind of had to resort to a little bit more hiking. By the time I moved past the Stanley Gap aid station, I started to feel my body breaking down a little bit. I reflected upon this during my grindstone video, but one of the things I realized during this race is, as much as there's kind of this sense of dread when the nighttime is coming and the darkness is about to kind of envelop the whole wilderness, and you know those headlamps are going to come on, and then you're alone in the dark for 9, 10, 12 hours, whatever it's going to be, there's something so beautiful about that time. I find that there are a few parts of running an ultramarathon that just feel deeply personal. And for me, one of those times is when the first night falls on the course, and you're still feeling pretty good, and you're running on your own, and you look up and you can see like the stars, and the wilderness kind of takes on a life of its own. And it's just one of the most surreal experiences when you just realize, here I am in the middle of the mountains on some single track trail with my headlamp on, running over 100 miles. It's one of those kind of times where the surreality, just the strangeness of what you're doing really hits you, and to me it's just kind of a beautiful experience. Once you hit kind of the high point after the Stanley Gap aid station, you start descending into the Flat Creek Loop. This was the first part of the course where I started seeing the leaders actually coming back at me. And one thing I love about ultra running is, no matter if it's the person who's in first place or the person who's in last place, everybody's having a great time and encouraging each other. So I'm getting passed in the opposite direction by like the overall men's and women's leaders, and they're like cheering me on, and I'm just like some nobody who's like 7-8 hours behind them at that point. But it's really cool to see how invested even they are in everybody having their best race. As we are progressing through the course, and I know this Flat Creek Loop is coming up, I'm thinking, fingers crossed, maybe Flat Creek actually means that it's gonna be flat. But I mean, I think I was being pretty stupid because this is the Cruel Jewel 100, and I don't think there's really any flat ground on it at all. But all things considered, Flat Creek was really not that bad. It ended up being a 6-mile loop. You do it twice during the course of the race, and other than a few creek crossings with some kind of rocks that you were hopping on in order to try to keep your feet dry, this was not that bad of a section of the course. It was actually fairly runnable. And during this section is when you'll actually pass the bib punch, which you get to do twice on the race to just prove that you went out there and you ran that Flat Creek Loop. Descending into Camp Morganton, which is the turnaround point, you hit another road section that probably went for about 2 miles. And at that point, my feet were really starting to hurt. I find that once I get on my feet for like around 15 hours or so, the pain starts to set in. And at that point, that was not the most comfortable part of the race, let me tell you that. I got to Camp Morganton, which was the turnaround point, which is roughly 52 miles. I actually had like 54 miles on my watch, but who knows if that's accurate or not. Got there at around 3:30 in the morning, something like that, and met up with my mom and my dad, and my friend Joe was there, and my brother, who was going to be my pacer, was getting pumped up in the middle of the night to take me home, 56 miles. So I did a quick change of clothes there, put on a long sleeve shirt, and I did a shoe change as well. I ran the first half of Cruel Jewel 100, and these bad boys, these are the Hoka Speed Goats. awesome shoe, loved them, but unfortunately this pair came with a slight defect, which didn't really make itself known to me until probably about mile 35 or 40 when I started getting a pretty gnarly blister on my heel because of some bunching up of the cushioning there. So I wanted to roll with these things the whole race, but unfortunately just because of that issue, I knew I was going to have to change. So I ended up switching into my tried and true. These are the Saucony Peregrines. These guys, they're like old friends to me by now. I have run in these for half of the Rocky Raccoon 100, half of the Grindstone, actually more than half of the Grindstone, and then half of the Cruel Jewel 100. And when I say I ran in these, I don't mean just like this model. I mean this exact pair of shoes has gotten me through, has been on my feet for 300-mile races. So I owe these shoes a lot, I think. So anyway, I picked up my brother at Camp Morganton, and that's just a great feeling to have someone you're running with. My brother and I get along great. It was awesome to run with him and just kind of joke around. We were just joking about random stuff for probably 2 or 3 hours running together. Absolutely nothing to do with running at all. We're just talking about like YouTube videos and movies and stuff like that. And it was just cool to take my mind a little bit off of the pain that was really starting to settle in at that point. The first low point, like truly low point that I hit during the Cruel Jewel 100 was coming out of the Flat Creek Loop for the second time. You go up a pretty steep hill towards the 6-mile out and back spur trail. And this was the first time where I just felt like it was bonking a little bit. I really slowed my pace down. I started just taking in a lot more calories and salt to try to see if I could bounce back a little, because I knew that a really difficult part of the course was on the horizon. I'm beginning to find now that I've run my third 100-mile race, which is by no means a lot, but it's enough that I've started to accumulate some experiences. And I've found that in each of my races, there's kind of a section of the race that is just brutal. And for the Cruel Jewel 100, it was absolutely this spur trail that went basically off the edge of a cliff down to the Weaver Creek aid station. I cannot express like how drastically steep this part of the course was. You kind of just keep descending down, down, down into like the depths of the earth. And all the while you're seeing these runners coming back up the spur trail out of this valley, and everyone just looks so defeated, so you know you're really in for it. And after about 2.5 or 3 miles or so, you finally hit the bottom of this thing where you turn around and there's an aid station there. And this aid station was just, it was pretty painful. It was the first place where you really started to see runners looking a little bit defeated. And as far as I'm concerned, this is really where the Cruel Jewel really lived up to its name, because this spur trail did not need to happen. This is a 100-mile race without that spur. Yet you're tacking on 6 miles that are just absolutely rough. And it's ultimately unnecessary, but the unnecessary nature of it is what I think kind of gives the race its character. So once I finished with that spur trail, things kind of slowed down a lot. This is where my kind of steady run, walk rhythm started to turn more into just power hiking with like tiny little segments of running mixed in. I actually found it very helpful during this race that no matter how bad I felt, I was still trying to run for maybe a minute at a time every few minutes, just to keep my running muscles fired up and not get too comfortable with my hiking muscles. Getting back to that road section the second time was pretty awful. For as good as it was for me the first time, it was as bad or worse coming back, because while the road was very runnable outbound, inbound, it was just hell for my feet. It was just really painful. It was also exposed to the sun pretty consistently, which was tough at a time of day when the sun had come up and things were really starting to heat up. And this is Georgia in May, so it's not cool. This is about the time of the race when I started thinking about finishing times. I always set myself kind of a ground rule that I'm not going to really think too much about finishing a race until I'm around 30 miles to go. and at the Old Dial Road aid station inbound is where you kind of hit that 50K remaining part. And I was starting to look at my pace and my time, and I was thinking, you know what? I had set for my goal to run right around, let's say 39 hours. I wanted to break 40, and I thought a 39-hour or 38-hour finish was well within reason. But I started doing some math and I realized, you know what? I think that 35 or 36 hours could be very much on the table here if I stay strong, if I stay put together. So for me, this is one of the major victories of the Cruel Jewel 100, is that whereas at Grindstone, I felt that I let my mental weakness kind of bring me down in the second half of the race. I had a lot of trouble getting motivated to get out of aid stations. I was feeling very sorry for myself when I started to feel like I was in a lot of pain. This time around, I went into every aid station in just like assassin's mentality, knowing like, look, I know I'm gonna be feeling really bad. That just comes with the territory, right? So you've almost got to just play through it in your mind. I'm gonna feel awful, but that's okay. I'm not gonna lose my head here. I'm gonna keep my head on straight, get the food I need, get the nutrition I need, get the gear I need, and get moving before I start feeling sorry for myself and thinking like, oh, I got so much time left. I got so many miles left. You know, boo-hoo, who cares? I signed up for this thing. I knew it was gonna be tough. So let's keep moving. Keep one foot in front of the other, get to that finish line. One of my friends who runs ultras has a great saying. He always says, relentless forward progress. Keep moving forward no matter how much it hurts, no matter how slow you're going. Every step forward is a step closer to the end of the race. Going back through this kind of Twin Peaks section of the course where you hit the Will Scott Gap and Skeena Gap aid stations, I found that the kind of forgettable part of the course was much harder than I remembered. And this is kind of a theme for any out and back race, is that a lot of times when you're feeling good going outbound, you're not thinking about some of these hills. And then when you're coming back, they catch you by surprise. You don't remember. It's like, who put this hill here? This wasn't here before. But sometimes you just gotta realize that you can't trust your memory. You have to be prepared for the worst, which is sometimes things that you blocked out of your mind from the first time. Heading out of that last crew aided station, which was Skeena Gap, it was about 5 o'clock, give or take. And I knew I only had 22 miles left. Got to see my crew for the last time. My brother was with me, and God bless him, he had never run more than 25 miles, which is what he did with me when he paced me for the Rocky Raccoon 100. And here he was going, at this point, over 30 miles, heading towards, closer to probably 60 miles. And at that point, the finish line becomes real, right? You go most of the race trying not to think about finishing, trying to just focus on what's in front of you. And then when you only have about 20 miles left, you start to allow yourself to really believe you're going to make it and imagine that and use that to fuel you through the last couple of hours. So again, doing some math at this point, started to think that 36 to 39 hour finishing range was very doable. But I'm also kind of racing the sun at this point because I had remembered that there's a section on the Dragon Spine that I found the footing to be very tough. There's a lot of overgrown grass, a lot of rocks, and I really wanted to hit that point of the race before sunset. So my brother and I kind of booked it through the Skeena Gap to Fish Gap section of the course, trying to put that behind me so I could get to the meat of the Dragon Spine in daylight. And thankfully I was able to do that. Move through that section, tough section of the Dragon Spine in relative ease, crushing some of those steep uphills, steep downhills, feeling very confident, starting to pick up the pace even a little bit, knowing that a good finishing time is well within reach. But then, as in every race, something unpredictable happens, something that really threatens to derail the race. In this case, it started to rain. And if you're thinking, okay, who cares? It started to rain. It rains during a lot of races. If you're out on the trail for 2 straight days, the weather's probably going to turn at some point. I get that. I was expecting it. I had rain gear. That wasn't the problem. The problem is that you're at a very exposed part of the race, running along a ridge line, very high up in the mountains. And this part of the race, when it started to rain, when the trail started to get washed out a little bit, everything turned to a mud pit. And the course was soaked. Everything was just this slippery, awful mud everywhere you went. I got to the point where I had to actually take my trekking poles, which I had with me the whole race, and just dig into these steep hills in order to kind of hoist myself up with just about every step. It was awful. I went from probably hitting about 20-minute miles, maybe even a little bit less, to all of a sudden you're averaging like 30-35 minutes a mile, and it just sucks the life out of you. Not so much because it's difficult, which it is, it's more because you start to see your estimated finishing time slip away. You start to think, I thought I was going to be done with this thing 4 hours from now. Now it's looking like 5 hours, or 6 hours, or 7 hours. And that time gets more and more, and you start to lose your composure. And for me, that was the only time of the race where I started to despair. The course became so difficult to traverse at times that I started to wonder if I was going to be able to finish. I had the motivation, I had the determination. I knew that if it were up to me, I was going to make this thing happen, but ultimately, sometimes things happen outside of your control. And this was one of those occasions. The course had become so treacherous that I was having trouble even keeping my footing. Some of these steep sections, I had to kind of sit down on my butt and slide down parts of the course. And of course, you've got some steep drop-offs on parts of this course where there's just cliffs. So I started to get very paranoid. Am I gonna fall off the edge of a cliff trying to finish this race? Ultimately though, kind of just kept going and tried to put behind me that sadness that this was gonna take way longer than I anticipated and that my goal finishing time was probably kind of out the window. So got used to just kind of hitting 30-minute miles, keeping it nice and steady, keeping it safe, trying not to hurt myself, and working my way towards that fire pit aid station, which I knew was the last aid station, last real aid station, and from that point on, I thought I can survive. If I hit that aid station, I can make it. This was also part of the course where I started hallucinating pretty badly, seeing a lot of shadows, seeing a lot of faces and animals and things that obviously were not actually there. At one point, there were lights in the distance, probably some town, miles and miles from there. But from my vantage point and from my exhaustion, this looked to me like lights at an aid station. And I started to become overjoyed. Oh my gosh, this fire pit aid station that I thought was miles away is actually here. We're already there. And it just never got any closer. It's like a mirage in the desert. It was so mentally taxing. So all said and done, probably covered that fish gap to fire pit section of the course, which was like 7.5 miles. It took me hours. It took hours, and it was the single most difficult section of running I've ever done, both mentally and physically. Also, I had mentioned before that my GPS was kind of off the whole race, and I'm looking at my watch, and I see that we're like over 100 miles already. Yet the end of this course is nowhere in sight. So I just started to get frustrated. Up until that point, I had just kind of gone with the flow and been like, you know what, I know that this is a long race, I know this is a tough race, I know this is a cruel race, but I'm gonna roll with it, it's okay. But when I saw my watch beeping for 100 miles, when by my estimation I still had like 9 miles to go, I just felt myself getting very flustered, and I was really losing my composure. It didn't help also that coming out of the last aid station, fire pit, I thought we were going right downhill. I thought we were coming off of Coosa Bald and going back down into Vogel State Park. I figured the uphill is done, it's all downhill. Wrong. Coming out of fire pit, you actually hit like a 600-foot vertical climb over the span of like 1.5 miles. It's honestly one of the steeper hills on the course, and I totally forgot it existed. Finally though, you top out, and I remember that on the way out during the daytime, when we first hit this part of the course, like 6 miles in, the views were beautiful, the views were awesome, but of course it's at nighttime now, there's rain, no views to be had. So you kind of keep your head down and realize all that's separating me from the finish now is this unimaginably steep hill down the mountain. And this was just a frustrating part of the course. I was getting passed constantly by people. I felt very hesitant with each step. My feet were hurting immensely. And also I just didn't feel confident that any step I took was not going to be met with just kind of the ground giving way under my feet. So my brother actually went ahead of me, and I used him as a spotter. He took his trekking poles. He was telling me where to step, where the ground was a little bit drier and easier to gain some traction on. So that was helpful. But that part of the course just kept going and going and going. There were people passing me, and everyone was sharing this same frustration. Where on earth is this water drop station that marks the 3.7 miles to the finish? It just seemed to never come. But of course, all bad things must come to an end. So we finally hit that water drop aid station, 3.7 miles to the finish. This is great news. And I just remember at this point was when I started to become kind of overcome by a sense of delirium. There's a point here where there was a road crossing, and it was a little tough to tell where the trail picked up on the other side of the road. And I heard this voice coming from the wilderness, and I'm thinking, am I having auditory hallucinations now on top of the visual hallucinations? But no, it was a real voice. It was a runner who was kind of just wandering in place, asking, where do I go? Where's the trail? And when I saw the trail, it was so clearly marked, but we were all in this state where just nothing is making sense, right? You've been awake for going on 2 full days of running and without sleep. So at this point, all bets are off. Like, sanity is kind of gone. Forget about hallucinations. At this point, I was just having these thoughts that were just like fever dreams while I was running, things that made no sense. I remember at one point I wanted to tell my brother that we should negotiate with the race director, and maybe they'll decide that we don't have to actually run the last 3 miles. We can just call it right there. I also, for whatever reason, thought we had already passed the finish line and that they were sending us back up into the mountains to run another 3 miles. Of course, none of these things made sense, but my mind was just, I was losing it. I was losing it. I'd been awake for too long, and I just needed this race to be over. Finally, though, the trail comes out of the wilderness. You're back in Vogel State Park, and all of the disappointment over the last few hours of how that part of the race had gone just completely goes away. And I remember coming out of the woods, there's a sign on the tree that just says, it may have been cruel, but you are a jewel. And I got a kick out of that, because I was thinking, you're darn right, it was cruel. That was one of the more brutal things I've ever subjected myself to. But now is time for the kind of victory lap here, right? Through Vogel State Park, 1 mile to go. And I got so excited to just be back in civilization with the finish line there. My brother and I actually were able to run the last mile. He was joking with me, how fast do you think you could run right now? And I tried my hardest to run as fast as I could, which I felt like I was running like tempo pace, but it was probably going like 13-minute miles. But all said and done, it was fun to just be able to pick up the trekking poles and just finish running, finish strong. And then, of course, you get through that finish line and you pick up that monster buckle, the thing I'd been dreaming of for 39 hours and 24 minutes, I believe, was my finish time, which was, I was happy about it. I broke 40 hours, which is what my goal was, but I think that if that rain had not come through, something like 38 hours or maybe even 37 hours would have been possible. But hey, you got to take what's on the table for you. And in this race, 39 hours was what I ran, and I'm happy about that. They had some great food ready for the runners at the end of the race, so grabbed like some rice and beans and stuff like that. Avoided sitting down in a chair. I remember I did that after both Rocky Raccoon and Grindstone, and I could not get back up, so I said, not going to fall into that trap again. Beware the chair, as I heard multiple people say during the race. It was really hard for me because my friend Joe went out. He got a pack of IPAs, and he's like, "Oh man, do you want a beer?" And I was like, I can't tell you how much I want a beer, but I just can't. Right now, I just cannot drink a beer. I feel like I'm gonna go into like hypothermia here. I just need to get home, get in the shower. So that's what I did. We got back to the Verbo, got about 3 hours of sleep, woke up the next morning, went out on the porch, said Catholic Mass for my family and for my brother and for Joe, which was a really great way to kind of celebrate everything that I'd gone through the previous 48 hours. And just a time to really just praise God for the experience, right? For every part of the experience, the beauty of it, of being in nature, the difficulty of it, the parts where you're tested, the part where you have to come face to face with your suffering and your humility and your weaknesses, right? Because this is why we do these things, these races that are so daunting. We do them not because we're strong, but because we need to confront our weakness. All people do. We need to know what it's like to suffer if we want to exhibit any amount of strength in our day-to-day lives. Finished up the weekend with a great breakfast with my family at this kind of cool hole-in-the-wall spot in Blairsville. And then my brother and I got in the rental car and went back to Atlanta, where we both had a flight out late that evening, so we got to take our time. And then we both flew out at the same time in gates right next to each other. So it was I'm so grateful for how much he pushed himself to help me finish this race. He was not supposed to go 56 miles with me. My dad was going to cover some of that, but because of an injury, he gave it to my brother, and my brother took it and ran with it. Probably not literally, mostly I guess he took it and hiked with it, but we'll just say it was a really solid effort. He completed the Cruel Jewel 50, right? And doesn't even get a medal for it, so very thankful. So that's it, that's a Cruel Jewel 100, an awesome race. I hope this was helpful in some regard. I like to, of course, tell the story of my race, but I hope that there was something in here that if you're planning on running the Cruel Jewel 100, that this description of the course and kind of how things look when you're running the race, I hope that this was helpful, and I hope that this encourages you to run this race. This is a monster of a race. I'm not going to deny that, but it is definitely doable. The time frame is pretty generous, 48 hours. You can do that. So if you want a challenge, if you want to hit that pretty extreme elevation on the East Coast, and you don't want to get on a plane and go out into the Rockies, absolutely head to Blairsville, Georgia. Sign up for the Cruel Jewel 100. Great race directors, great volunteers, awesome course. You will not be disappointed. So thanks everybody for sticking with me and watching, and I'll see you all next time.